Welcome to Tribeca. I'm Michelle Hulst. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Trade Desk. And this is our first live event since the beginning of last year. And it is my first live event at the Trade Desk. I joined in the pandemic last year, so. It's so great to see all of you in my new role here, so I'm so excited. As we get started to return to kind of this new kind of normal, travel is starting to open up, people are starting to go into the office, we thought it'd be a great time to bring the whole industry together for an event like this. And given some of the discussions that we had just before we got started, I think you all feel the same way. Although I didn't talk to you if you all felt the same way as I did when I was getting dressed this morning. I actually had to put on real pants. I was wondering where my sweatpants were, but anyway, I figured it out eventually. We also have thousands of people joining us via live stream around the world, so hello to everybody out there. The response to this event has been absolutely overwhelming. And I think it's because we've all been through so much over the past 18 months. And obviously, we've been dealing with a global pandemic, but we've also experienced so much change in our industry as well. And it's really changed how we approach digital marketing as a whole. And it has been so much change. But there's also been really so much progress, and that's why we're all here today. Jeff is going to come up in a minute and give us his take on those important issues facing our industry, and really how we all can come together to help work to solve them, and how we created Solimar to help marketers really meet this moment. We're then going to have Vinny Rinaldi, who's Executive Director at Wavemaker, part of Group M, come up and give his take, as well as Joy Robbins, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at the Washington Post. I am so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to spend this next hour with you all. And so please, with that, let me introduce Solimar.
There's a moment at the end of the day when the sun and the sea meet. The blue sky gives way to a swirling panorama of pinks, violets, and tangerines. An endless canvas of color captured in one brief but remarkable moment in time. Right now, as an industry, we're experiencing a similar moment at a time when more brands are embracing the open internet to realize the full potential of their valuable first-party data. When a changing TV landscape gives viewers more options and advertisers more opportunities to reach them. When new technologies allow us to strike the right balance between consumer privacy and relevant advertising. And when the role of marketing in driving business growth has never been more apparent. Finally, we can envision the future of modern marketing. But capturing this moment, this opportunity, requires a new approach. Introducing Solimar, a new digital advertising experience from the Trade Desk. Backed by over a decade of innovation and a singular vision, Solimar illuminates the full potential of your digital advertising campaigns, putting your business objectives at the forefront, unleashing the power of your first-party data securely on your terms, and providing the world's most advanced measurement marketplace so you can understand the full impact of your campaigns with precision in a way that's simply not possible in a walled garden. Because this moment is what you make of it. Solimar. Meet the moment.
Please help me welcome to the stage the CEO of the Trade Desk, Jeff Green.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And those of you joining from around the world, the thousands of you that are joining over a stream, thank you so much for attending as well. I'm really excited. I'm actually a little bit nervous too. Number one, because I haven't been in front of people at all since early 2020, but also because of the hundreds of people that invested most of the last 2 years into creating this product. And I'm really excited to reveal it today. So I'd just like to say welcome. For those of you that don't know, Solimar means sun and sky. Solimar. And I'm really excited to talk about this really critical and beautiful moment that we're in right now, that I believe will define the internet forever. And it's really up to us, and especially those of us that are committed to the open internet, to really take advantage of this moment, because it's never going to be the same. So that moment at the end of the day when things are really beautiful, but there's also the end of something, it is exactly where I think we are right now. That's in part because of the global pandemic that we've all been living through. And actually, I think there's something really beautiful in this moment as it relates to the pandemic as well. So bear with me, I'll explain. In December of 2020, the first vaccine was placed in the arm of a 90-year-old woman in the middle of the UK. Since then, 3.25 billion doses have been administered around the world. So in 6 or 7 months, I think that is one of the greatest achievements of humankind in our lifetimes. What a remarkable moment that we're all living through as well. But this pandemic has changed everything inside of media, and we would be fools not to think about it, consider it, and adapt to it. So let me just talk about some of the major vectors that I think have changed because of the pandemic. So number one, advertising is a leading force for economic recovery, both for growth and recovery. But probably every person that is hearing me talk about this works for a company who's had to adapt and say, we're still in business, we're still here, we have a product, and you had to change the way you message it as well, which is that we care about people and we want to make a difference in their lives. And I think at times advertising has been credited as just selling people products that they don't want. But during this pandemic, not only have we been creating growth in the economy, but we've been reminding people of the value of the products that we represent and how critical that is to a functioning economy and society. It's been a great reminder over the last 18, 24 months. Also, big tech is bigger than ever, more powerful than ever. It's been under a lot of scrutiny, and that's in part because in addition to this being true, this has also been true, which is privacy is currently center stage. And I actually think this is largely the undercurrent of this moment. And it's in part because many big tech players are using it as both a sword and a shield to protect themselves in some cases, and in other cases, it's to gain more land, if you will. And it's really important that all of us acknowledge that that's happening, as well as we figure out what we need to do on behalf of the open internet and our own individual companies. So there's also been this amazing shift towards connected TV. And that's in large part because of just all these forces during the pandemic where everybody was forced to stay at home. There wasn't nearly as much content being created. Sports were canceled, which gave a lot of months of reason for people to cut the cable. But all of this has just had a huge impact on the fact that CTV will never, or TV will never be the same. And it is permanently changing the media landscape. So I personally think that premium video will represent more than half of what is very soon, in a couple of years, will be the $1 trillion pie that is global advertising. I think premium video will represent roughly half of that. I also think it is the most effective advertising that's ever been created, because we're going to take the moving picture and sound and voice, and we're going to combine that with the ability to leverage data to personalize who's receiving that. When you put those things together, I think it's the most effective scaled advertising ever. And because it is fragmented in a pretty beautiful way, it's not really monopolizable. It can't be owned by any one company. Netflix has done a phenomenal job, but they have something like 11% of screen time, according to their own reports. When you look at how fragmented television is, I think that's putting pressure on walled gardens, putting pressure on every form of advertising to be a little bit more democratic. And that's part of the reason why this moment is so important. It's also really important because retailers are doing something they've never done before. We'll talk more about some of the biggest in the world and some of the moves that they've made, but they've begun to understand the power of their data and to do things with it that are very responsible, yet at the same time advance their cause and also advance the cause of the open internet. So it's impossible to talk about this moment without also talking about the pressure that is on the average marketer today. So when the pandemic started, we all felt the pressure. I mean, I remember sitting down with our CFO and saying, how long is this going to last? And how do we protect our employees? How do we make certain that we never have to do layoffs? Those are questions that I think every CFO in the world was asking as the pandemic started. That naturally creates a tendency to go to your marketing department, which often spends a lot of money, and say, how can we do more with less? We're still in that moment. Given that we're still in economic recovery, we're still being asked to do more with less. How do we become more efficient? How do we become more data-driven is something that's being asked of every marketer. Every person in the CMO's office is being asked some form of that question. So some people, because of that pressure, are saying, maybe I just need to keep my head down. I've even heard people talk about things like fate in this moment, that, oh, Google's going to do their thing, or insert a big tech company here. It's inevitable. They're going to be X or Y or Z. And I don't believe that properly captures what this moment is. I see something very different, which is that over the next year or two, we're going to define the future of the open internet. And I think it can be even better than what it's ever been before. And I want to talk about what those actions are. So before we talk about what we built with Solimar, I need to talk a little bit about why we built it. And I think that it's really important that many of us get aligned on that, because then it becomes easier for us to be rowing in the same direction, if you will. So first of all, we built what we did because we believe that the internet is the most powerful invention of humankind. Think about in history class when you learned about the printing press and how significant that was, and then take whatever sales pitch that had, or the encyclopedia salesman had when you were a kid, or when I was a kid. Probably some of you are younger than that, but I'm dating myself. But whatever pitch they had, the internet has one that's exponentially better. Think of the impact that it's had around the world, not just about information distribution, but the way you purchase things, the way you get access to healthcare or water, or the way that governments have been changed. It is the most powerful invention, I think, in the history of mankind. And we have to be very responsible with the way that we use it, deploy it, and we have to certainly prevent too much power being aggregated so that a few companies control it. So there is this question that the internet is wrestling with right now, and has been for a couple years, and that is, how is it going to pay for itself? How is it going to continue? How is it sustainable? And there's this question that a few are asking, which is, can it be owned? Can I own a portion of it or not? And that's something that I think is up for all of us to decide. Let's talk about what's at stake. And this is highly relevant to what I'm especially going to talk about with Joy later. But I think there are three really sacred institutions that are at stake. One is music. Because music margins have been really tight for a long time. And since the music industry struggled for years after sort of CDs went away and everything went digital to figure out how to monetize, there's not enough margin left for you to have access to nearly all music at companies like Spotify for, what, $10 a month, without there being highly relevant ads for those that are open to seeing them and paying for their music consumption that way. So the margins are just too thin that if we disrupt the quid pro quo of the internet, music's in trouble. Maybe even more concerning is journalism. That if you take $10 CPMs and turn them into $5 CPMs, what happens there? What's at stake? And the last thing I just wanted to highlight on this is just that television, which I think has become one of the most important institutions around the world, but especially in an American household today, and that without some form of relevant ads, there is no way to sustain the premium content that we're all experiencing right now. It's a really important moment for us to figure out how the internet's going to pay for itself and how to preserve the quid pro quo. So a couple other things that we've always believed. One, we have always been a champion of the open internet, and I've been talking about some of these things since we formed the Trade Desk 12 years ago. And I mention that only to say we're not talking about this now because it's come into favor or because it is in our interest to talk about that as we become bigger and more competitive with companies like Google. It is because we've always believed it, and that's what's motivated us from the very beginning. I know that's true of many of the companies in this room. I know that's true of many of the individuals in this room. And so I'm just happy to be working with you on what I think is a really important cause for humankind. So I think right now there's two types of companies in the world, those that are trying to control the internet and those that are trying to enable it. And one of the biggest problems that has happened, especially inside of ad tech, is that as soon as somebody gets a little bit big, they start to hoard whatever it is they've created. This is especially true when people had cookie footprints 10 years ago, where if you had any size at all, you said, I don't want to share that advantage because I'm going to empower some other ad network or somebody else in the ad tech space. And that's part of the reason why we created UID 1, which was to give away that advantage that we had to raise all boats. And so I just want to really reinforce something that we believed in from inception. We believe it even more now because we've seen it work. And that is that when we raise all boats, we benefit, that's true, so do they, and we're okay with that. We're okay with everybody else benefiting as well because we're all better off because of it. And so instead of taking that approach of, hey, we want the world to be better for us and no one else, let's instead make it better for everybody. And we think that that means that you have to preserve the quid pro quo of the internet. And that quid pro quo is very simple. You see relevant ads in exchange for free content. Now, every website doesn't work that way. Netflix doesn't. The Wall Street Journal doesn't. But the vast majority do. And the internet becomes anemic if you don't have that. There are some people who've tried to say, and by the way, my children are here today. Thank you guys for coming. Faith. Faith was CEO for a day a couple months ago, so more trade deskers know her than my sons. But my sons, this is one of my favorite pictures of them, of actually all three of my kids, because we were sitting on the steps in Singapore, and I was taking pictures of something else, and then I turned around and got this moment where they were not paying attention to me at all and just being themselves. And I love the way that my daughter's leaning into my son and how my middle son is just being totally uninhibited. But some people have said something that is kind of offensive to me, to be honest, during the discussions over the last couple of years about this quid pro quo of the internet and about the open internet. And that's that because we want things to be relevant, that for some reason that equates to we don't care about privacy. And that's just utterly ridiculous. And everything that we do, including anything that comes close to touching privacy, we run through a gauntlet. And the very first step in that gauntlet is, how will it affect us? How will it affect our children? Is this something that we want for us and our children? And we have to sort of eat our own dog food, if you will. We have to be the same. We have to experience the exact same internet that everybody else does. So how do we want it to work? And then, of course, we also run down the gauntlet of what does the law say and what are we after? And what was the intention of GDPR in addition to what is the law? But privacy is something that means a tremendous amount to us. And I just want everyone to know that that is the foundation of every decision and every product that we promoted, everything we built here, and that includes especially Unified ID 2. Bottom line, the internet is suboptimal without relevant advertising. And meeting this moment and addressing the opportunity and all these vectors is what this is all about. Solimar is a new DSP to meet this very moment with pressing issues, and it is, of course, impossible for us to talk about Solimar, the house that we built, if you will, without talking about the foundation first, which is identity. So when we created UID, and of course I'll talk about UID in a second, but I just want to talk more macro than that for a minute. When we created UID, we were not out to create the only currency of the future of the internet or trying to create something that was just to replace cookies. We were trying to create something that was bigger than all of that. We did not want it to be the only currency. I still don't want it to be the only currency. And I'm also fine if there's other currencies that are even bigger or better than it is. But we basically had these principles that we wanted to go into it. One, we didn't want to put all the money in one bank, if you will, because there were a bunch of solutions that to me were really dangerous, which is, oh, our bank is the most secure, so let's put all the money there. Or said another way, we do a better job of protecting privacy, so every brand and every consumer in the world should give it all to us. That sounded really dangerous and like the plot of a good Hollywood film. But so no honeypots is the way they talk about it in privacy land. We also needed clearer explanations of this quid pro quo of the internet. We had to create more and better, more transparent controls for consumers. We also believed in the concept of raising all boats. We wanted whatever the new system was to be opt-in instead of opt-out. We also wanted to hold operators more accountable. And that meant they had to sign up for terms and conditions, and how could we administer those? And we also wanted to make certain that it could be encrypted, in some cases double encrypted, or triple encrypted, as we're doing in some countries. So that makes it possible for there to be more control and more security, and that makes something better for consumers. A nice to have would be if it could be open sourced, because then you distribute the power. Because I kind of look at it, when you look at how powerful the internet is, it's a little bit like government. You have to do something with the power that's created, and you can either consolidate it all and give it to a few, which history has shown that can at times be dangerous, or you can distribute it and do something more democratic or more like a republic. And that's just philosophically what we think is better for the internet. So we created UID, and it has been the greatest movement that I've ever been a part of on the internet. And this is probably the part I was most nervous about, because I wanted to give a shout out to just a couple of the companies that have been involved, and the list just kept growing. But advertisers like Unilever and Procter & Gamble, and publishers like Pandora and the Washington Post and Tubi, and major TV industry companies like Blockgraph and OpenAP, which represent Univision, Viacom, CBS, NBCU, Fox, AMC, which AMC we just announced last week, they separately will integrate directly as well. Inside of Blockgraph, Charter, Comcast, Viacom, CBS, measurement companies like Nielsen and Oracle were among the very first to adopt this. Nielsen, the gold standard for measuring television. Pretty much the entire ad tech ecosystem, and then data integrators like Snowflake. That's probably the most under-discussed major adopter of UID. Of course, Maven, which has 270 brands, including Sports Illustrated, History, Biography. And then last week, after Google's cookie announcement, not only was Maven announced, but also Newsweek, one of the biggest names in journalism. So to have those, and those are just a few of the names, to have all of those companies adopt in such a short period of time is unbelievable. And to see the momentum accelerate after Google's recent announcement has been really phenomenal. So I'm just so delighted to be a part of this. I think it's because of the things that it stands for. So UID does check the box that it empowers consumers in a greater way than cookies ever could have. In part because it's opt-in instead of opt-out. And it also protects something that I think is really important, which I'll talk about in just a second. But the open internet solution, whether it's UID or anything else, has to be bigger than cookies. And some people, when they're talking about UID, have gotten this wrong. And they've assumed that this is a response to Google getting rid of cookies. Nope, this isn't just about cookies. As I mentioned before, CTV, I think, represents half the pie, or the premium video represents half the pie as we march towards $1 trillion TAM. And in order to to really be effective and in order to really empower consumers, we have to have a solution that transcends browsers, mobile devices, TVs, whatever it is. So I mentioned before that we were trying to protect something that I think is really sacred, really important, and that is the relationship between content owners and consumers. And there are some walled gardens right now that are really trying to get in the way of this. In fact, they are even falsifying email addresses so that consumers don't give their email address to any of the content owners. And I think that is a mistake, and I think it gets in the way of the quid pro quo of the internet. And as a consumer, I don't want that, because I want to some extent, look in the eye the people that I'm trusting with my data. And I want to make a decision when I log onto a specific site or a specific app or a specific channel. I want to make a decision about the company on the other side and how much I think they can be trusted. And I would much rather have that be distributed than just among 2 or 3 companies who claim to be doing that for everything, everywhere, when in fact all they can control is what's in their ecosystem, and even the biggest can't be the whole internet. Right? I remember having a discussion in an internet law class at USC in 1999 about, will AOL own the entire internet? And it was, oh yeah, it still may happen. But there was passionate argument about that. I think it's ridiculous to think anybody can control the internet, control the entire internet. And so as a result, we need a framework that creates a better internet, but definitely distributes the power, because I think it's actually a fool's errand to even try to aggregate it all. So UID is simply a common currency that can't be controlled by any one company. You know, I have a good friend who had a brief career in the NBA, and Robert Parrish was his mentor. And before he went on his first game, he walked into the middle of the garden and he pointed to all the fans and he said, "You see all these people? They were Boston Celtic fans before you got here, and they'll be here after you're here. This is bigger than you." And I've always just wanted to be a part of something that is bigger than me, and especially that's having a really positive impact. I don't know that there's ever been anything I've been a part of that is so big as UID and the open internet, and especially at this moment. So it's with that background that I'm excited to talk to you about Solimar and the product that we've created. Hundreds of engineers have been working for about the last 18 months, some longer than that, to create Solimar, which is built for the modern marketer in this very moment. So let me introduce you a little bit to Solimar. So the very first product that I want to talk about inside of Solimar is the measurement marketplace. And this is an important contrast to the state of walled gardens today. And so if you're not familiar with it, let me just unpack that a little bit. Before I do, let me just say why I think this is so significant. You know, I remember when Steve Jobs introduced the app marketplace for the iPhone, and how he said this is going to be available to every developer so that you can create products, products that will improve efficiency, entertain, can do anything to get in front of the millions of people that use an iPhone. I think about the power of the media buyers that we have, and I'm so excited to put in front of them the ability to measure the way they want to, which is different than what happens today in a walled garden. So right now, inside of walled gardens, there's a bunch of pros to being a walled garden. You can control the ecosystem. It's easier to manage your supply chain, if you will. As somebody who's been obsessing about the supply chain, it is really hard in an open, competitive market to create change there. But that's one of the advantages to walled gardens. But one of the massive disadvantages is that you have to grade your own homework, if you will. You have to go to every marketer, every brand, and say, if you'll share with me your first-party data, usually at a user grain, I can put that to work for you, but you can never give back reports that do the same for them. You can't be symmetrical in your partnership. So instead, you give back impressions, clicks, conversions, as measured by that company. So there is this grading your own homework problem. So, you know, what went into the measurement marketplace was, I think, represented in a case study that is Walmart. So let me just talk about what's happened at Walmart. I believe Walmart has had an institutional epiphany that I think is a game changer. I think this is one of the most significant moves made on the open internet in the last few years, and I think it's been under-discussed, in part because we've all been in our disparate places. But the institutional epiphany was that Walmart could, of course, go create a media company that was just focused on leveraging its data to build yet another ad network or another silo. And they've done that in the past, and they've been successful at it. But what if we approach that with a new paradigm, which was, instead of just trying to get a few incremental dollars to leverage data, what if we used our data to measure better everything that's being bought? And when you look at the billions of dollars that companies like P&G or Kimberly-Clark or Unilever or Hershey's or Coca-Cola, you look at all of the billions of dollars each of those companies spend on their own, if you could get all of them to be optimizing their media to sell more product at a Walmart, then you spin the Walmart flywheel faster, and you're playing to the strengths of Walmart instead of just trying to beat Amazon at their own game. So by Walmart participating in a measurement marketplace and making it possible so that hundreds of others can do the same thing, you make it possible to get rid of the grading your own homework, and the open internet starts to play to its strengths, which is to come together. The power of numbers, of objectivity, of specialization, of independence. And that is exactly what's happening in this measurement marketplace. So it is helping the internet reach its full potential. Instead of us grading our own homework, we'll make it possible for you to measure it any way you want, and especially to close the loop. So you show thousands of ads up funnel, and then somebody buys something at a Walmart or somewhere else, and then you can measure it, you learn from that, and you're optimizing media to those purchases. This is a sample of those that are participating. This is, of course, a global advertiser, and so you'll see some names from around the world. And most of these we've talked about before. I do want to make an announcement of a couple additional participants that are joining today. So the first is Home Depot. So Home Depot has over 2,000 stores in the US and Canada and Mexico. They do over $100 billion in sales. They are and obviously an amazing and growing company, especially in this moment where there seems to be a lot of building. I can't get a contractor to come to my house, so there's a lot going on. But in that environment, helping brands close the loop from the top of the funnel to the bottom so that you, in a responsible way, can make brands make better decisions and help measure what's really working and what is not, is a game changer. Gojek, many of you in this room probably don't know who they are. Fortune magazine named them in both 2017 and 2019 of the Fortune 50 companies that are changing the world today. They started as a ride-sharing app in Indonesia, which has one of the fastest growing middle classes in the world, but they're also pointed at Vietnam and Thailand, and they're growing like crazy. And they became a payments company, not dissimilar from many of the ride-sharing apps in Asia, where they become something much bigger. As a payments company, they've actually become even bigger than they were as a ride-sharing app. And with that, of course, comes lots of insight when you're processing billions and billions of US dollars every month through that payments app. And then Flybys, you might not also have heard of unless you've spent time in Australia, but they're basically the loyalty program for a lot of different companies. In fact, some of the very first companies involved, joint venture between a gasoline company, a supermarket chain, and a telco. So when you put all of those together, you obviously have some loyalty cards that can be used across a whole bunch of different things. So between those three, we're just continuing to add, and there are many more to come. The amount of partnership discussions that we're having right now to make this marketplace robust is bigger than ever. I need to pick up the pace a little bit, so I'm going to keep going. So the second thing that we built in Solimar is data management and onboarding. So I think as you look through the sort of the start to finish of any ad campaign, there were three places where I think there was the most room for improvement. One was at the end, which was measurement, and there's two at the beginning. And those are the ones I want to talk about next, which are data management and onboarding. one of the things that walled gardens have done really well is they've made it easy for you to put your first-party data to work. So you can easily upload in a system like Facebook your data and insight, and then they can put that to work right away. We've needed the equivalent, and the combination of UID with all the other signal that is in the market has made it so that you can create or deputize your data in the most secure way and the easiest way that has ever been created for the open internet before. I don't think people really understand that at this moment, data onboarding is the best it's ever been in the history of the open internet, in part because of UID and cookies and just all of the signal that's happening at this moment. So it's a very exciting time to sort of put all that to work. Something that I want to talk just for a second about is the math of the open internet. And what I mean by the math of the open internet is we often get these inquiries. In fact, I have to answer this question at nearly every earnings call. Apple made this change, or Google made this change, and it didn't seem to affect your business. Why not? And I've had that question every quarter for the 4 years we've been public, because there's been at least one change every time. And it's often because somebody like Facebook or Twitter or whatever reacts to those changes that Apple or somebody else makes, and they were hurt by it. Why was the Trade Desk not hurt by it? So let's just say ballpark, there's 10 million ads available every single second on the open internet. Our job at the Trade Desk, because we've focused on the buy side, is to look at those 10 million and figure out which 975 to buy for Home Depot or for a soda company, or pick any of the Fortune 500 brands that we represent, which is most of them. And so if you're only trying to select 975, and if Safari, let's say display represents, call it 20% of our business and shrinking, and Safari represents a small fraction of that, in fact, 3% of the browsing internet. So you basically take away 1%, you take our 10 million and move it to 9.9. All I'm trying to do is figure out which of the 975 to buy. You change my denominator by 10 million to 9.9, but I'm still selecting roughly the exact same 975 as before. That's why we weren't hurt. And that plays into everything that we're talking about today, including the supply chain, which I'll come back to in a second. So I mentioned that there's process at the end that we need to improve, and there's process at the beginning that we need to improve. Part of what we have to improve at the beginning is also the way we set goals. So what we've found since the launch of NextWave 2 years ago is that there's lots of improvement for the way people define what success looks like. So yes, we can do a better job of measuring it, but if we weren't clear in the first place about what we're after, we're never going to measure it well, and we also leave no room for AI or ML to do any work. And so we just have to get better at this. So we created a whole new framework for capturing goals. And what we found is that it's really difficult to capture from media buyers the many different KPIs that they have. So while we've started with that, there's lots more to come. So you can select multiple goals, you can put them in priority, but at the end of the day, if you're very specific about your goals, that's going to drive better choices. We also have reinvented our planning tool, which is related to this. You'll recall in NextWave, for those of you that have been customers since NextWave, we introduced a planning tool. And you know, we were looking at planning and saying, everything in planning is done wrong. And the reason why is because we have this tendency to plan what's digital going to do. We assign a budget to digital, and then we tell digital to go do this thing. And then we have all this data in digital that could have informed the process upstream that we don't ever use. And so then we spend all this time reassigning budget and redoing what we set up in the very beginning. So we created a planning tool to help inform that process. The downside to doing it that way is that if you just use a planning tool at the very beginning, you could be learning all along the way, things that you could be doing better, things that you could reallocate constantly. And so why not make Planner re-examine everything always? It doesn't mean you have to reallocate budget constantly, but it gives you the opportunity to reallocate where things are performing. By setting better goals, it brings us to the fourth part of Solimar, which is that we now can put to work better AI. And of course, we call our AI COA. What this means, though, is that there are a bunch of places where we can help make decisions and we can run math. Human beings are better at creating hypotheses and using intuition. Machines are typically better at running math. And so why not get the best out of both? What we found is that we're often asking you to make decisions that we don't need to. If we have statistical significance, if we're extremely confident in the numbers, we can make that decision on your behalf. As long as you're willing to let us, we'll make the decision on your behalf with full transparency as to why and how the decision was made. I mentioned before about the supply chain. I want to just talk about this for 2 or 3 minutes. I will not do it justice. In fact, we're putting together a program for EDGE, which is our learning and development that we make available to the world, to talk more about the state of programmatic in an executive course, and especially to talk more about identity in specifics. Everybody who's attending this, whether virtually or in person, will send you information about it. But we'll talk a lot more about the supply chain. I've been obsessed about the supply chain and making it more efficient because, as I mentioned, the open internet is much more difficult to control or influence the supply chain than inside of a walled garden. And that is why we're competing with walled gardens so aggressively, is because we have to do better there. That's why we have to do better there. So there have been a bunch of initiatives that have been created, and we have done a horrible job at the Trade Desk of talking about all of these different initiatives. It's partly because they're nuanced and complex, but I just want to take a minute to talk about why they're so important. Ads.txt was an important initiative that I don't think ever would have been if it weren't for both the Trade Desk and Google working together. This was a moment where our interests were very much aligned and our visions were aligned, which was to get rid of fraud on the internet. It had a huge impact on that, but we also kept going. We went further and we added sellers.json and the supply chain object, which makes it possible to audit the entire supply chain. We've recently asked the sell side to adopt something called Global Placement ID, which gives more metadata about individual placements so that we can make more informed decisions on behalf of advertisers. And I just want you to know we're about to release supply.api in the next month. And what supply.api is an API where we're essentially publishing the same way that we ask publishers to in ads.txt where we're buying from, so that the supply chain can be more competitive. And it's something I think is really important for all of us to be aligned on. We are not interested in putting companies out of business, especially on the sell side. We are trying to make them more competitive. We want the entire supply chain to be more competitive. We want it to be more transparent. And we want everyone in the supply chain to earn their keep. And what that means is you add more value than you extract in fees. So the last thing that we've launched with Solimar is a better user experience. And you know, when you're asking people to make thousands of improvements to a campaign, it can be really overwhelming. So what we did is we counted clicks, every single thing that was happening in our platform, and we looked for efficiencies. Is there a faster way to do it? Why are we asking them to get there? And we looked for opportunities where we were asking people questions where we weren't even giving them the data to make the decision. Why are we doing that? We're just torturing our users. Let's take that out of the system, or let's give them data so that they can make informed decisions. We also want to make certain that we don't take 2 clicks to do the wrong thing and then make it 4 clicks to do the right thing, which we were doing all over the system. So let's reverse that at a minimum, but let's also just try to get rid of doing the wrong thing. So I think the 5 things that are the most impressive in the UX that we're shipping are: 1, it's simple and sophisticated. 2, we have a UI that is very unique to the ad tech space. Nobody else has one like it, and it's in part because we're trying to create a dialogue between man and machine. Let's point out something that you may want to look at. And then in other cases, when we know what you want, because we've done a great job of understanding what your goals are and how you're going to measure them, we can make changes for you. Let's just figure out how to make this process more efficient, but the only way to do that is with a dialogue. And then let's put data next to decision. So we're just constantly scrutinize every decision we're asking the user to make and saying, have we given them enough data to make that decision? You'll see more visualizations like this one, where you can look at every campaign you're touching and seeing where you need to go dive in. That's one thing I just think the entire space can do a better job of, is helping you figure out where to dive in. And I think we're better than we've ever been before. And once again, our UI is giving people time back. So Solimar is a product that is meeting this moment. It is giving you and your team a chance to shine. So before I go, I do want to talk about one other thing, and this just goes into to just some of the philosophy that we've been talking about. And it's actually a venture arm of the Trade Desk. So we founded a venture arm at the Trade Desk called TD7. The reason we call it TD7 is because we got profitable on $7 million, which is something that very few companies do these days. It seems like it's measured in hundreds of millions now instead of millions. We're sort of traditional and old-fashioned in that regard of why not create a business that can make money and then grow organically. It meant that we had to work our butts off when we were a young company, but it's something that we think has contributed massively to our success. But I was talking to a founder who is building a business on our APIs, and he said something I thought was really important that really changed my paradigm, which was, I don't think I could have ever created my business if I wasn't building on the APIs of the Trade Desk. So every single thing we talked about today is also available in an API so that other companies can innovate and build a business on top of the Trade Desk. I think that's really critical for the open internet to be successful. But sometimes those companies also need funding. This is not going to be like, we're not opening an office on Sand Hill Road. We're not trying to do as many deals as possible. But when we see a company that we think that we can invest in and increase the strength of the open internet, we will. So I'm excited to announce that we've made an investment in Chalice. The company's here today, so Adam Heimlich, its founder, will be mingling, and if you want to say hello or congratulations, please do. I'm super excited for him and Chalice to be the first investment that we've made. Bottom line, I don't think there has ever been a more exciting time in the history of the internet than right now. And what I really believe Solimar is, and what all of these engineers have spent all this time building, is something to help all of you, all of your companies, take advantage of this moment for the open internet and to define where it's going to go. So I really believe what we've just talked about is the most advanced DSP ever created for the open internet. And I just want to thank all of you for being here, for being a part of it, for being our partners. I don't feel like I've gotten to look as many of you in the eye as I would like over the last couple of years because of COVID. It feels like we skipped over 2020. But I just want to say to all of you who can hear me today, thank you so much for your partnership. And I look forward to what we can do over the next couple of years, because this is a very important moment. Thank you very much.
Three new ways Solimar transforms media buying. 1. Build campaigns around business objectives. Our new, more intuitive goals-based setup puts your business objectives front and center from the start. 2. Unleash the power of your first-party data. With Solimar, you can activate more of your first-party data more easily and securely than ever. 3. Measure what matters for your growth. Solimar optimizes campaigns in real time, measuring and comparing performance across every channel. Upgrade now.
All right. I know we can't stop talking. It's like we're all together. It's so exciting. How excited are folks about Solimar? And Jeff, thank you for all that. All right. Next, I'd like to welcome Vinny Rinaldi to the stage. He's going to have a little chat with Jeff. And Vinny's the executive director and the head of investment and activation at Wavemaker, which is a part of Group M. And prior to that, he's held some leadership positions at little-known companies like Amazon and Hershey's and Dentsu and Google. But really the common thread throughout Vinny's career has been his championing of data-driven advertising and the value that that can provide for marketers, and especially as it relates to CTV. So I love listening to Vinny. I'm so excited to have you here today. Please join me in welcoming Vinny to the stage. Thank you.
I'll wait to set.
Thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure. I was saying to Vinny as we were prepping, our biggest challenge is going to be to stick to our time limit. So,
We've had this conversation quite a few times.
Exactly. Vinny, you have just been one of the most amazing spokespeople that I've ever heard for both value as well as for the case or the sales pitch that is connected TV, and especially just avoiding things like cheap GRPs in the name of sort of not spending in CTV. But I'd love to talk about what's happening at this moment as it relates to the discussion between price and value, and especially in your new role at WPP.
Yep. So it's a great question. We've honestly talked about this a lot. And frankly, when you think about the new value, we've got to kind of remove, it's really hard to do, and I went through this, but you have to remove cost from the equation, which is, one of the biggest challenges. But when you keep going the cost route and keep chasing more frequency, it goes back to what you talked about, the ability to control. You lose that impact because you're just chasing the bottom line. And when you have those two metrics, they kind of deflate where you're going after as a business objective. So if you're chasing more frequency just to have the cost balance, you miss the ability to reach new people. You miss the ability to reach and grow your business. And I think those are probably the more important KPIs to start with. Start with your business objectives and kind of work backwards to create what your value should be. When you think about it, how do you correlate a completed view and or a viewable impression back to a business outcome? It's really hard to do when you think of it in those natures. So how do you start with, okay, my goal is whether it's grow household penetration, grow sales, which is everyone's goal, but what is your true business growth? And then how do you work backwards into getting the new value exchange that isn't so deterrent by just how low can I go, which I think is kind of the quid pro quo part of the internet that we've been chasing.
Yeah, I've always seen you as a visionary, and whether it was when you were at Hershey's or inside of WPP, more traditional companies that have bought media in a more traditional way, how are you having the value price discussion? Where are you seeing movement and what's effective? Because you're so articulate about that. I'm curious where it's working and how you frame it.
Yep. I mean, it was simple. You talked about a 125-year-old chocolate company. We were pretty fast movers in this space. And when you took a step back, or I took a step back to understand our business better, at the end of the day, we were trying to reach everybody with a mouth. How do you inherently grow household penetration? You control all of the elements of frequency and extend reach. By doing so, all of those equations, you remove costs and you actually start talking about what is growing my business, my bottom line. And what you start seeing is tonnage over cost drives ROI. Always. It's a simple math equation. You talked a lot about math. But what we're missing is that effectiveness. And you talked a lot about premium inventory, and I think that's one of the most important things that we lose sight of. That premium environment drives the highest effectiveness, and effectiveness is actually revenue due to media, not just an inflated ROI. So when you bring those two things together, you have to start talking about where eyeballs are going, what's going to be the most effective way to reach, and a lot of this talk track never talked about the word efficiency. I think we tend to use that word interchangeably with low-cost CPMs, and we tend to put programmatic in an efficiency bucket as a channel versus really the technology that allows us to do data-driven advertising. And a lot of the way that we talk to our brand teams about this in Hershey's element, but now at a greater scale across WPP and our clients, you have to think about what's going to win the business over for that brand. Like, how are they going to speak to a new consumer that's going to inherently drive their business? It may not be the ability to address an audience. Addressability can be any data set. And I think that's what we also inherently lose focus of. We're talking about just audiences. How do I reach this person? But what about data from your supply chain? What about data from Walmart, from the sales ecosystem? Those things inform a greater good and can be used in its simplest form as geo-targeting in a DSP. But we tend to put programmatic in a channel bucket versus actually looking at it as the ability to drive any data-driven ecosystem to the future. And one of the best ways that we did that in addressability was simple form. What is addressable media? The ability to address every impression with a data point. And we never talked about it as an audience. So when you start telling a different story, the perception starts changing and starts moving into, well, what data do I have in my own building that can inform a richer media ecosystem that can close that loop, whether it's tied back to Walmart or whatever end goal is. How do you use all those elements to really drive that forward?
I think you've just touched on so many things right there that are just really important. But it's especially just redefining programmatic and getting people out of, programmatic started at sort of the leftovers of display, and it's climbed its way up to the premium side of TV. And so it's no longer about low cost. It is about efficiency. And it's not programmatic as a channel, but it's data-driven versus guessing. And why wouldn't we apply data when we can? And when we can, at a granular level, that's what programmatic means. It's not a pipe. It's not a religion. It is
Some
simply,
may say it is.
Yeah, it is simply a more data-driven way to make choices.
Yeah, and I think, in that capacity, that goes back to what data is the most important to me. And it's like choosing which is right and which is wrong. You talk a lot about cookies, and that doesn't really resonate too much with CTV, but when you are using a cookie-based ecosystem, I challenged everyone, and I did a lot of this in some of my past, of go to whether it's bluekai.com/registry or some other places where it shows you your cookie profile. And to your point, it's guesswork. It's a 50-50 chance. I was a male and a female. I was 35 to 85. And those abilities, when you're using those profiles to know, or am I actually hitting the right audience? What is the effective reach? Not just reach. Everybody can get incrementality everywhere. But what's the most effective incremental reach that actually drives my business? That means a lot to me. And I think using the right data sets is inherently where we're moving towards. But that's where the platform, the pipe connectors are really where we have to start thinking about the future state of technology and not just as a channel.
I love it. One of the things that I've argued at times, and in fact, when we were talking about this session, I was saying to my team, I'm not sure that there's ever been a more articulate person to talk about why a $30 CPM in connected TV is worth more than a $10 CPM in linear. And I've just heard you talk at length about not chasing cheap GRPs. Can you just unpack that for the thousands of marketers that are watching this today, who many of which are doing that very thing?
I mean, this upfront will not be that much drastically different, I think, from a pricing perspective and where we've entered into how much we're spending. But I think what we've inherently learned is that it's simple economics, supply and demand. There is less and less supply every single day. And we've also thought about a lot of this is how do we buy in a day part? And I'm not going to steal it because it actually came out from Google in like 2017 where they talked about prime time is any time. And I think that's really true because we have so much content that we consume at any point, but it doesn't mean we're consuming it through linear channels. It could be through anything. And what we inherently do when we chase the lower frequency or really the lower cost media, we're buying tons of frequency just to get that one extra reach point. And if you spend another $1 million to get one reach point, you're inherently getting 10x the frequency. You could put that $1 million into another ecosystem and get 5 reach points. What's more valuable to you, the $30 CPM or the 5 reach points? And I think those are the questions that you have to start asking yourself. And it goes back to what's going to solve my business goal. It really does start there and work backwards. So if I'm going to get 5 more reach points, is that going to inherently grow household penetration and steal share from my competition? Probably more than that one, which is also a household I've reached a number of times previously.
Exactly. I think there's something sort of implicit in all of your comments today, and really just when I see you on stages in general, and that's that marketers and advertisers need to focus on winning hearts and minds and less about touches. and price per touch in particular.
Yeah.
Like, what can you do to be more impactful, and how can you measure whether you're actually winning hearts and minds? Because touches can be commoditized, they can be super cheap, and they can also be incredibly ineffective. They can even be negatively effective in the sense that you can make people hate your brand if you advertise in the wrong place or at the wrong time or with too much frequency.
Exactly. I think, you also have to, it all depends on category. What is the right frequency, I think, is still unknown depending on what category you're in. Food and beverage, it could be literally immediate. You could buy it, you could consume it, and then go back and buy again. Whereas you may have a longer cycle, whether it's a car, a television, you do research. So you have to understand all those touch points, but by overextending, to your point, there are certain brands that you just are like, oh, I hate that brand so much because I haven't stopped seeing them. I'm watching, a game on ESPN, or I'm watching a new show on TNT, and the same ads are happening over and over again because that control factor is being really removed from an advertiser, and it inherently hurts you. So I think it's, how do you get back to an interoperable? I know that's like the new hot word right now, and probably it's not an acronym, but it's going to become like an acronym. But interoperability is true. How do we create API-like instances where I can use the data I need to make my business grow, interoperable with you and everyone else, versus putting it in 7 different places and none of them speak to each other? I lose tremendous value. And in fact, across all those places, you're probably reaching the same person 7 different times, and if you have a frequency cap of 5, you're at 35 times 5. You're overextending yourself, and I think that's where that interoperability is really key, and how we move towards the future, which inherently will be hard with some of the walled gardens. But I think as we talk about it more and more, that opaqueness will hopefully start to remove itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why I just think connected TV is the thing that is putting the most amount of pressure on the walled gardens, is because when you buy in these silos, if you have 30 different silos, then your reach and frequency is exponentially worse and impossible to manage than if you have 5.
Yep.
And CTV is just too fragmented for a walled garden, if you will.
It is, but then I think you have to go back to content. Content is king. And if you go back to the content providers, that's where you really want to have that, cutting out the supply chain or making it more efficient. How do you go direct while using a controllable deal ID in some cases, so that you want to be in the most premium content where the most eyeballs are, but you want to control that frequency layer? And that's, I think, inherently where we're moving towards. It's still a challenge to make sure that the tech works, because to your point, the distribution of content goes into 5, 6 different plugged-in devices or streamable devices. And that's where, we almost have to take a step back, is how do you use the buying ecosystem in partnership with the supply side to really control those elements as they then distribute out where the eyeballs are.
Exactly. It's extremely complicated because part of the ecosystem is fragmented by content or percentage, roughly half. The other half is distributed or is divided up via distribution, and that's more concentrated. So it's just, it's a nightmare to manage reach and frequency when it's divided those 2 different ways.
Very much so.
So right now, we've talked a lot about this moment, and part of it caused by the global pandemic, part of it caused by the state of discussion in privacy. There's just been a whole bunch of things that we talked about leading up to this moment. What's your take on what marketers need to be thinking about at this particular moment? Just becoming a little more macro.
I think if you wait for perfection, you're going to miss the boat. There's nothing perfect right now in a measurement ecosystem. There's nothing perfect in any capacity. But you need to challenge yourself to really test and learn, do and pivot, whatever you want to call it at this moment, but really try new things. And I think that's the only way you can start looking at the shift of budgets into a more diversified portfolio. Consumers already are shifting. Consumers don't know if your ad was placed because you bought it linearly or through a digital environment. They don't have any idea. So really, only people that work in this industry know that. So we have to take a step back and really think through that. So I think about testing and learning agendas, really putting in place measurement. What do I want to learn and how do I go do it? And then it may not work, but learn from it and go forward. And I think that's really important as we move forward into this industry of, linear this year was a big jumping point of supply diminishing. So where are they going? They're going in every channel, CTV first, but also other places. So how do you use data to inform your entire ecosystem, not just one part of it? And I think that's really important to test into.
Fantastic. And last question, it just because of your unique perspective where you spent a bunch of time inside of brands, and now you've had a fresh look in this moment inside of the holding companies. What advice or observations do you make of what's happening inside the holding companies?
I think everybody's on their own journey, especially from a brand perspective, not even from an agency perspective. We have to look at every one of our clients and understand what path they're on, how far along they are or how far behind they are, and how do we help them get to where they should be. And that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and I think that's very apparent as what's happening in the marketing place, in the marketing ecosystem. So, what we're doing is really taking a step back and devising plans for everyone. Now, we're having a high-level talk track that we've talked about. How do you outsmart the ecosystem, not outspend it? Just throwing money at the problem doesn't necessarily mean you're going to solve it. So how do you be smarter using data-driven tactics, but then take every client down this new journey? A pharmaceutical brand is going to be way different than a new economy brand like a Coinbase or someone of that nature. So, just understanding where everyone is and then helping them along that journey is going to be really key for us as we move forward.
Amazing. Vinny, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Really
I appreciate it.
this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff and Vinny. Who knew we'd have to do so much math today? I was like, my head was spinning a little bit. But next, let me welcome Joy Robbins, who's the Chief Revenue Officer of the Washington Post. And prior to the Washington Post, Joy was the CRO at Quartz. And prior to that, she held senior digital ad sales positions at both the NBC and the BBC. And we are thrilled to have Joy with us today. I just want to say, typically journalism isn't really known for having early adopters, and many of you know that's not the case with the Washington Post. So they've been a true leader from the very beginning. They've been a champion of the open internet. They've been an early adopter of UID. And in addition to being a market leader, they power hundreds of newspapers across the country through their Zeus platform, and they have such a massive impact on the open internet today. So please join me in giving a warm welcome for Joy.
Joy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So great to have this discussion. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You may not know, the audience may not know that we recorded for Mad Money and Jim Cramer earlier today. Jim Cramer, when he met Joy, and I think he already knew you.
Yeah, we've met once or twice.
You've met before.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He just came up and was just singing your praises and was singing the praises of Washington Post in part, and not to put words in his mouth, because of what Washington Post is doing for the open internet. It's just a really amazing thing and really critical thing for what's happening. Washington Post is a great standalone entity focused on journalism. Why do you care about the hundreds of local companies? You're doing so much for others.
Yeah.
Most people don't know what Zeus does. They don't know about these others. Can you explain why and maybe what as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think let's actually start with why. I think your presentation nailed it. It's a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think we have responsibility from our journalism to inform the public, but we take that mission and translate it to the business side when it comes to really supporting journalism outfits across the country and frankly across the world. So backing that up a little bit, as you know, the Washington Post has gone through an incredible transformation, both in our journalism and in our technology. And about 2 summers ago, we launched Zeus Technology to really be the only monetization platform built by a publisher for publishers, essentially really giving publishers control of their ad supply chain while still maintaining control over the partners that they work with. And that really came together in our first launch of Zeus Technology, Zeus Performance, I should say. So Zeus Performance really is a framework that helps improve the ad and user experience on sites, on our partner sites. And so what that means is it creates faster, more performant advertising inventory, which ultimately results in higher RPMs, while actually improving the reader experience across these publishers as well, really taking out the choice between quality advertising and user experience that so many publishers grapple with. We believe that it's important to be able to deliver both. And so from a scale perspective, We're powering about 110 sites right now with another 150 in the queue. It's
Oh, wow.
3.5 billion impressions on average per month, and we anticipate doubling that over the next year. And so what that all then amounts to is what we're calling Zeus Prime, which we're launching later this fall, that is essentially a connection between publishers and advertisers that allows advertisers to have access across quality performant inventory at scale, supporting local journalism.
Amazing. I can't even say it loudly enough, just how important I think what you're doing is and how critical I think it is for the open internet, and especially just the corner of the open internet that is dedicated to journalism, which I just think is critical to functioning governments around the world, functioning society around the world, and to take it and not just sort of take care of your own, but to raise all boats is just incredibly noble and important.
Thank you. And we take that mission very, very seriously. And I think we've seen the performance in this technology taking CPMs up for our publishing partners over 40%. Viewability higher than 75% across publishers that had half that in the beginning. And again, it's not just about monetization as much as it is the support of a thriving advertising ecosystem. Essentially, advertising is meant to create business outcomes, and that will only drive more revenue flowing through these publishers. So if we can do that effectively and continue to take what we've learned at the Washington Post that we've been able to invest in and reinvest that, redeploy that across the open internet, we create a stronger collaboration and collective between all of us.
I love it. Maybe let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. So, as I was speaking earlier, trying to just help frame what's at stake. I don't know that that's more easily articulated inside the context of journalism. So maybe let's just go through a thought experiment. If we take $10 CPMs based on relevance and move them to $5 CPMs because we make them less relevant, what happens to journalism? What happens to your hundreds of local partners?
Well, the business model of publishing is primarily advertising and subscription revenue. And I think we know very well that some businesses have different models that emphasize one or the other. However, if you're taking relevant advertising, which is essential to performance in the end, and completely disintegrating that, while the advertising industry as a whole is resilient, there will be things that come along to help readjust, recalibrate. At the end of the day, if we're taking half the revenue out of publishing, you're greatly going to diminish their efficacy, both in the journalism that they create and the innovation that they're able to create that drives better user experience. So that is a huge part of why we are continually investing in testing, in innovation, in experimentation to really make sure that we're finding different ways and partners that can help us mitigate those for our own business, but more importantly for those of the hundreds of publishers that rely on us.
Yeah, I mean, my thesis is that if you turn $10 CPMs into $5 CPMs, there's probably a handful, New York Times, Washington Post, and a couple others, who can live through that.
Sure.
Incidentally, they're also not likely to be affected by it because of that same sort of strength and the size of their audience. But if you turn $10 CPMs into $5 CPMs, then the Salt Lake Tribune is in trouble.
Yeah.
The Dallas Morning News, probably in trouble.
That's true.
And so, to me, like what you're doing is just so critical for local journalism.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for what you're doing. I would love for you to talk for just a second about what this moment represents for you in the open internet, as well as, you guys have been phenomenal advocates for UID in part because of this moment. Can you talk about the moment right now that is the open internet and this and the discussion?
Sure. I mean, I think that we are all recognizing that it is incumbent upon all of us to protect what we've built through the creator economy, through journalism, and supporting that. And so the ability for us to experiment and test and learn and work with partners like UID too, we need to make sure that we are controlling our own destiny. And if we don't do that, we squander the biggest opportunity that this moment represents. Because right now, if we do nothing, we essentially give the advertising industry or the advertising revenue streams to the walled gardens. And what we need to make sure we're doing is that while we are protecting the identity and the privacy of our readers, who essentially represent the entirety of the value of the publishing industry to begin with, we need to make sure that we're protecting that by choosing partners who can help support that journey for us. But it is one that I think for so long, we haven't made a lot of innovation in this space. And forces, including the pandemic, including a lot of what's going on in the privacy discussion right now, are now forcing us to really re-examine that and to really choose and look at partners who can really innovate and help us do that.
I'm curious, one of the things that I've seen inside of journalism in particular, because for decades there was this separation between making money and sort of pure journalism, and they just never talked to each other.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, as Washington Post has come up with this formula to just help hundreds of others, what that looks like today. Because a few years ago, you would see the sort of native ads at the bottom that were just not the same journalism as the stuff that was above it. How have you fixed that, and sort of what's the recipe for making that?
To be honest, it's one of the things that makes me the most excited about being in news journalism at this time, because I think that while that separation remains strong, obviously one cannot influence the other, there is recognition that relevant advertising, that experiences that users and readers are used to because of the native product, actually transcending into then the advertising product that we're creating through, that is informed by data and reader patterns and things that we really understand, it ultimately raises the entire experience of the site in general. So just relegating ads to the bottom of the page or to specific boxes here and there, the idea that you can actually be more relevant and have a discussion in a well-lit, informative, truthful kind of area that really matches both what the reader cares about as well as what the specific context of that article might look like, it's ultimately creating a better reader experience, and it's actually resulting in better business outcomes for our advertisers. So I think that we have really embraced the opportunity to iterate, to really innovate on how we think about the relationship between our editorial calendar, our journalistic mission, and the way that we really think about advertisers and how they can add value to the overall experience.
I love it. I love it. Inside of the Washington Post, I know we had a lot of discussions. I know other companies did as well about unified ID. And Washington Post was one of the early adopters, and certainly one of those that has been early to be public about it as well. I'm curious if you have any commentary on why that was, what resonated in the pitch, and what's important to you about the future of identity.
Sure. I mean, I think that and I've said this before, we take our responsibility of being bleeding edge, first, and experimental very seriously, not just for the business that we do, but for the 100+ other publishers that we power. So in order to really do that, speaking about UID2 and understanding some of the vision that you laid out today, it's something that we feel compelled to be early entrants on, to help advise the industry, to make sure that we are not standing still, and ultimately not only helping to identify solutions, but also helping you iterate on those for the sake of the publishing community, really helping to be the voice of some of the publishers who may not necessarily be at the front table for those discussions.
It's a good segue to what might be my most important question for you today. So Google, of course, made an announcement recently to postpone their suspension of cookies. And I imagine that there are some parts of the publishing community, especially inside of journalism, but all publishers and content owners, that just took a huge breath, a sigh of relief, and said, oh, good, instead of 9 months, I've got 2 years and 9 months, or whatever that ends up being. One of my worries is that can create some complacence, and that perhaps people will misunderstand that what's happening right now in the identity changes and the replacement for cookies is in fact bigger than cookies. what are your thoughts on that? And especially just if you're speaking directly to publishers and content owners, what do you say to them?
Let me be very clear. Complacency is not an option. If we squander the time that we were just given to iterate and create more options for identity and privacy in the future, we essentially deserve whatever comes to us.
Right.
Because we have to take this time to really think about how we strengthen our businesses with the future ahead. We have to look at at partners that are providing solutions. We have to build our own solutions. I also think that one of the things that I always get concerned about, and I think we've made this very difficult for consumers to understand, is that walled gardens are good and the open internet is risky, or that doesn't care about user privacy or user experience. And I think something else I want to emphasize that we all have to be better at communicating is that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, our readers come to the Washington Post because they trust our journalism, but they also trust what we are going to do with any of the information that we get from them as consumers of our product, as subscribers. And so, it is more important than anything to protect that relationship, to protect that trust. And that for that reason, we need to be very deliberate about the partners that we choose to work with. And so I think the combination of this time that we just got back, for another 18 months to make sure that we do come up with the best solutions, that we do work with the best partners, anyone that is seeing that as kind of a relief is really kind of bound for their own deterioration.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a phenomenal note to end on. Words of advice and caution. And thank you so much for being here. I really
Thank you
enjoyed
for
the
having me,
discussion.
Jeff. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy, for talking about journalism and the role that open internet plays in its future. I had to stop myself from kind of jumping up and saying amen at the end there, because as you got rolling, it was great. Love it. Thank you to all of you for joining us, those folks that joined us in person here in Tribeca, and then everybody across the globe. Just so excited to come together as an industry to help preview or launch Solimar, and also for us to come together as an industry to really meet the moment. So thank you.